Y'all's just a little too OP. By Stephen Lake. A player named Robert walked casually along a simple, winding, dusty dirt road as he slowly made his way towards the village of Dunnigan, in the prefect of Lados, in search of his new team that would be arriving there soon for an adventure in Lands of Magic. Normally, unless it was part of a quest or a mission, he would typically use the inter-village transport hub to travel between them, to skip the need to walk long distances to get there. However, today he felt like he needed a little time in nature to relax, prepare, and center himself before meeting his new teammates and starting their first quest. So a little walk through nature like this was just what the doctor ordered, as his real-world friend would say. However, as he continued down the trail, he soon spotted a small village in the distance. As he approached its outer borders, he noticed that it had no walls to protect it. Usually every town or village, no matter the size, had walls, either for protection or to mark their borders to all those traveling through. Deciding not to think much about this, Robert continued forward, just as casually as before, and stepped into the village square. However, what he found when he got there was nothing he ever expected to see in such a small town. Not 20 feet in front of him stood a kid, probably not much more than 5 years old, next to a massive, super heavy sword that looked to easily weigh well over 70 pounds. Robert walked over and tried to pick it up, but found that he couldn't even make it budge because of how insanely heavy it was. That was a surprise in and of itself. But what was even more shocking to him was when the young child reached over and picked it up as though it weighed next to nothing. The expression of befuddled surprise on Robert's face was beyond description. This grew even more so when the kid began swinging the sword around so as though it was made of cardboard. How was that even possible? He thought to himself. Even a mid-level paladin would struggle to wield something that big and heavy. Just then Robert heard the sound of something being dragged, but not anything normal. Whatever this was, it had to be absolutely massive. He slowly turned around to see what it was, and soon spotted a man of average size, stature, and build dragging a boar so huge that it made him look like an ant dragging a boulder. Robert's eyes grew steadily wider, sweat slowly beginning to bead on his forehead as he looked on at this in growing anxiety and fear. Just then another person stepped out of a nearby house and raced over to the man. "Wow, that's so big. How'd you catch it?" they asked. The man with the boar shyly rubbed his head and grinned at this. "Ah, this ain't that big. This is one of the little ones," he replied. "Little ones?" screamed Robert in his mind. "If this one is little, what must the big ones look like?" he thought. Just then the ground thundered as something absolutely huge began walking towards the village. Moments later, the face of a monstrously huge mama boar appeared over the treetops. This immediately caused Robert's eyes to grow impossibly wider and his hair to stand on end. The man looked out at the approaching mama boar and smiled. "Ah, it looks like mama ain't too happy with me taking her baby. Let me go talk to her and set things straight. Be right back," he said. Robert then watched as the man, who looked as average can be, suddenly exploded down the road at inhuman speeds, completely terrifying him in the process as the backblast of wind from the man's run tossed Robert's clothes around like a brief hurricane. Robert then watched as the mama boar spotted the man as he approached her. The mama boar then roared angrily at the man and tried to stomp on him, but then suddenly fell on her back. The next thing Robert saw was the mama boar, now thoroughly shocked herself, lifted into the air, and then heaved off into the distance like she were a tea saucer, screaming in horror as she did. Robert's jaw nearly hit the ground as he watched this unfold. Not long after the man came running back, stopped next to the absolutely massive baby boar, and clapped his hands together in satisfaction as he grinned. "See? I told you she'd understand," he quipped. Robert gulped nervously at this. Just then more dragging sounds could be heard behind him. He slowly turned around and was horrified to see a house cat, no bigger than a typical tabby, dragging a mouse through the village that was easily 20 times its size, and did so as though it weighed hardly anything. Eventually it stopped, gently tossed the massive mouse into the air, and then ate it effortlessly in a single bite. But even after doing so, the cat's size didn't change. Robert stared at this in confusion and pure terror. If the cat ever decided to eat him, he wouldn't even be a crumb to it. Just then another sound echoed in his ears. Turning to see what it was, he soon spotted, not far away, an old woman who was well in her 90s, sitting on a park bench near the village center, curling a dumbbell in her right arm. But it wasn't the fact that she was holding the dumbbell that shocked Robert the most. It was the fact that it easily weighed well over 2 tons in total. And yet the old woman lifted it as though it weighed little more than a feather. Deciding that it probably was best if he didn't hang around any longer, Robert cast speed on himself and then ran to get out of the village as absolutely fast as he could. But, as yet one last shock to him before leaving the borders of the village, the little 5-year-old child, the one that he'd first encountered upon entering, blew past him with great speed and deceptive ease, giggling and squealing at the top of his lungs, with his hands in the air as he did. But he wasn't just running to run. He was seeking to grab the cat, the same one that had just eaten the massive rat, and hug him. However, that cat wanted nothing to do with the little child, and subsequently leapt into the air to avoid the child, easily clearing 2,000 feet before air walking himself off into the distance. But the toddler would have none of that and copied the cat's movements, step for step, causing the cat to increase its efforts to escape the little child. At this point, Robert was beyond having seen enough and immediately cast a 5x multiplier on his speed buff in order to quickly put as much distance between himself and the village as he could. As he raced away into the distance, a trail of dust rising up behind him in a big, billowing cloud, the man with the baby boar walked up to the old woman. Pointing at Robert, he asked her, "So who's the slowpoke over there?" The old woman shrugged. "Probably just a visitor passing through the village," she replied. The man crossed his arms and grunted. I hope he's okay out there, what with him being so slow. Wouldn't want to see anything bad happen to him." Just then the toddler returned to the village, holding the cat triumphantly in his arms, much to the feline's chagrin. The man smiled at this, and then looked at the old woman. "Want to keep an eye on him, just in case?" he asked. The old woman grinned. "Yes, if you would please. But put your boar away first," she said. The man laughed. "Will do, Grandma." The end.